In this tutorial, I share with you my best 12 tips and tricks in pivot tables. Along the way, I will give you many bonus tips as well. I am Nabil Murad. These tips were carefully selected from my book, Pivot Tables from Data to Dashboard. So let's dive in. Tip number 1, filtering the values field. In this pivot table, I have the region and customer in the rows drop area, and I have two numeric fields in the values area. If I want to filter, I have the filter functionality for the region, I have the filter functionality for the customer, but what about the numeric fields in the values drop area? They don't have the filtering functionality. There are two ways to filter these fields. The long way is to select any cell outside the pivot table and then go to the Data tab of the ribbon and then click on Filter. When you do that, you are bringing the filtering functionality to the numeric fields. If you click on the down arrow of one of them, then I have number filters. If you hover over number filters, in the flyout menu, you see a set of comparison operators, equals, does not equal, greater than, less than, and so on. If I just want to keep the values greater than 500, then I select greater than, I type 500, and then I hit OK, and I get only the customers with a total sales above 500. I can clear the filter by clicking on this down arrow by selecting Clear Filter from Total Sales. Note when you bring this functionality, the number filters, if you go to Customer and click on the down arrow, I just have a text filter. But now look at the short way. What if I get rid of this functionality by going to the Data tab and click on Filter? The arrows are gone. Now if I go to Custom Filter, I get a totally different menu. I have label filters and I have value filters. If I select value filters, I have in the flyout menu the same set of comparison operator with only one or two options missing. So if I want the greater than, I select greater than. I want greater than for the total sales. I select total sales. I type 500. And when I hit enter, I get the same exact result without the need of going the long way. Let's clear the filter. I click on this down arrow and clear filter from customer. Here is a bonus tip. If you look at the region field, we have plus and minus signs. These are collapse expense symbols. If you don't want to see them, go to the Pivot Table Analyze tab, and on the right side of the Pivot Table Analyze tab, you click on buttons, and these icons are gone. Tip number 2, a slicer drop list. In this example, I have a pivot table which shows the sum of sales for each manager. I also created a slicer for the region, so I can filter the pivot table by selecting any region. I can click and drag to reset the filter. What if I want to create a drop list for the slicer? Let's see how we do that. I want to create another pivot table from the same source data. Instead of doing this, I'm just going to copy this pivot table. I select the entire pivot table. I hover over the border of my pivot table, I press Ctrl and drag, and let's say I want to put my pivot table at this position. Now I want to bring the pivot table field list, then I select a single cell, and on the right side of the Pivot Table Analyze tab, I click on Field List. I want to get rid of the current fields, and I want to drag the region to the filters drop area. And I remove the sum of sales, and I remove the manager, and I want to close the pivot table field list. I already created a style for this pivot table because I don't want it to be visible. So I go to the Design tab, I click on the drop list for quick styles, and I created a style which showed the font in white, no fill color, and no borders. I applied this style and I named it drop list. And now the pivot table is not visible. The only thing that is visible is the down pointing arrow for the filter. Now what if I drag this slicer and I position it in a way that the down pointing arrow for the filter of the second pivot table appears as part of this slicer. When I click outside, look at this. If I click on the down pointing arrow and I select East and then hit OK, my pivot table is filtered. If I click on the down pointing arrow one more time and I select South and then I hit OK, my pivot table is filtered. I can filter from the drop list, I can filter from the slicer, and I can reset the slicer by dragging. Note, because I created the second pivot table by copying the first one, then automatically the slicer is connected to both pivot tables. A bonus tip for you. What if you create the second pivot table from scratch? Then the two pivot tables won't be connected automatically. In this case, select the slicer, and then you go to the slicer tab of the ribbon, you click on report connection. It opens a dialog box where you see all the pivot tables available. You check the box for the ones you want to connect, and then you hit OK. Tip number 3. Multiple subtotals. In this pivot table, I have a region, a customer, and then two numeric fields. And then I have a subtotal for each region, which shows the sum of sales and the sum of cost of goods sold for this specific region. However, you might want to get more insights about your data. You might want to get the average, the max, the min. Is it possible to create multiple subtotals? In order to do that, I'm going to bring the pivot table field list by clicking on the pivot table analyze tab and click on the field list. In the pivot table field list, I click on the down arrow for the region and I select field settings. The field settings dialog box opens and it has two tabs. On the subtotals and filters tab, change from automatic to custom. I want multiple subtotals. I want the sum. I press Ctrl and click on average. I press Ctrl and click on max. I press Ctrl and click on min. Now when I hit OK, I would have created multiple subtotals for the same pivot table. If I close the pivot table field list, here is a bonus tip for you. I can bring it back by using a shortcut, and the shortcut is Alt-JTL. Tip number 4. Sort by typing over. In this pivot table, I have a manager, I have a region, and I have a sum of sales. By default, Excel sorts the region alphabetically. Then I have east, north, south, and west. What if you don't want this sort? What if you want a specific sorting order, like this one, south, east, west, and north? There are two ways of doing that. The long way is to go to the File tab and click on Options to open the Excel Options dialog box. Alternatively, you can use the shortcut Alt-FT, and then you hit A twice, AA. You will be in the Advanced category, and then you scroll down to Edit Custom List. When I click on Edit Custom List, I want to create a custom list that follows the pattern I want. Instead of retyping it, I could do that. I'm going to put the blinking cursor in the import box, and then I select the range and I want to import this list. I click on import, and here is the custom list created. I hit OK and another OK. And now if I want to sort by following the pattern of the custom list, I go to the region, I click on the down arrow, I select more sort options, and then instead of manual, I switch to ascending, and then I click on more options in the lower left corner, and then I take the check away from sort automatically every time the report is updated. And now if I click on the down arrow, I can select the custom list that I created. I scroll down to see it. I select it from here, and then I hit OK. And the region will be sorted by following the pattern of the custom list. What a hassle. If you are doing this task only once, you don't need to create a custom list. I'm going to hit cancel, and I'm going to show you how am I going to sort by typing over. What does it mean? I select the east and I'll be replacing it by south. When I type south and hit enter, for all the manager, south is at the top. Then I want east next, and I want west after east. Then I select north, I type west, and when I hit enter, I get the exact sort I want without the hassle of creating a custom list. This is called sort by typing over. Here is a bonus tip for you. I'm using a tabular layout for this pivot table. So I see the manager, and for each manager, I see all the region. It will look much better if I can center it here. And I'm going to do that by selecting one of the managers. I right-click, and then I select Pivot Table Options. In the Pivot Table Options, check the box Merge and Center Cells with Labels. When I check this box and then I hit OK, now it looks much better. Tip number 5. Repeat single field items. In this pivot table, I have multiple fields in the rows area: years, region, manager, and customer. If I want the items in any one of these fields to be repeated, then what I need to do is to go to the Design tab of the ribbon, and then I click on Report Layout and select Repeat All Item Labels. When I do that, all item labels are repeated for all the fields. But I just want to repeat the item labels for the manager. Then I'm going to undo, Control Z. And I want to bring the pivot table field list. The shortcut is Alt-JTL. And in the pivot table field list, and because I want to repeat the items for the manager, I click on the down arrow for manager, I select field settings. In the field settings dialog box, I click on the layout and print tab, and here is the option, repeat item labels. This one is different because it will repeat the item labels only for that field. I hit OK, and the item labels are repeated. Tip number 6, dynamic conditional formatting. I have a pivot table which shows a manager and the sum of sales. What if I want to highlight the top 3 sales amount or the bottom 2 or 3 sales amount? Then in this case, I'll be using conditional formatting in the pivot table. Before creating conditional formatting, I created 2 drop lists. In cell D1, I have a drop list which shows top, bottom, and none. And in cell E1, I have a drop list that shows numbers from 1 to 5. I start by selecting the top cell under Sales, and I want to create a conditional formatting rule. On the Home tab, I click on the down arrow for conditional formatting. I select New Rule. I want to create a formula, then I use a formula, and then I create a function. I type an equal sign, and I want to create an if statement with 2 conditions. Condition number 1, the amount, which is currently cell B4, should be greater than the third large amount in the entire list. The second condition, cell D1 should read top. So here is the combination of functions. For the key value of the large function, instead of hard coding a number, I'm using cell E1, the drop list that I created. Now if the 2 conditions are met, how would you like to format? For the top 3 values, I want a white font color and I want a green fill color. I hit OK and another OK, and I would have created the conditional formatting rule for one single cell. To extend the rule in the entire range, I need to manage the rule. I click on conditional formatting, manage rule. I edit the rule that I created, and I have 3 options in the edit formatting rule. I select the third option, all cells showing sum of sales values for manager. I hit OK and another OK. Do you see any conditional formatting? That's because D1 is reading none. But if I change it to top, now I can see the top 2 values. If I change the second drop list and I make it 3, then I see the top 3 values. Wonderful. I want to create a second conditional formatting rule for the bottom values. I select the top cell under sales one more time. I click on the down arrow for conditional formatting, new rule, use a formula, and my formula this time will be comparing this value and ask if it is less than the third small value. Then I use a small function within the if function. Here is my function, an if function with an AND. The first condition, cell D1, should read bottom, and the second condition, cell B4, should be smaller than the third small value, and I'm linking it to cell E1 so that I can change from third small to fourth small and so on. I want to format in red. I click on Format. I want a red color. For the font, I want a white color. I hit OK twice, and I would have created my rule. Now to test it, I need to change this to bottom. I change to bottom. Nothing appears because the rule lives in one single cell. So I select this cell, I go to conditional formatting, manage rule, and I want to edit this second rule by selecting the third option as I did before. I hit OK and another OK, and now I can see the bottom 3 values. If I want to change and I want the bottom 2, then these are the bottom 2. If I want the bottom 4, then these are the bottom 4. if I want to switch to the top value one more time and then change the number, and I created a dynamic top and bottom row conditional formatting in a pivot table. Here is a bonus tip for you. Conditional formatting highlights the value. What if you want to filter by the top or bottom values? Then I go to Manager, I click on the down arrow for Filter, I click on Value Filters, and here at the bottom of the list I see Top 10. I want to change this. I cannot link it to a cell as I did with conditional formatting. I'll make it 3 for the sum of sales. I want the top 3 items by the sum of sales. When I hit OK, these are the top 3 items. Tip number 7. Unpivot cross-tabulated list. In this example, I have a list which shows a car type and the number of cars sold in 12 months. I would like to unpivot this list to end up by having a column for the car, a column for the month, and another column for the number of cars sold. I'm going to use pivot tables to do that, but I need to use the old pivot table wizard. So I use the shortcut that triggers the old pivot table wizard, which is Alt-DP. And here is the old pivot table wizard consisting of 3 steps. In the first window, I select multiple consolidation ranges. Then I click Next. I will create the page fields. I click Next. And then I select the range with my blinking cursor in the range box. I click and drag to select everything. And then I hit Add. I click Next. And I want to create my pivot table in a new worksheet. Then I select New Worksheet. And I hit Finish. Here is the new pivot table created. It looks like the original data set with only one single difference. I have a grand total for the rows. I have a grand total for the columns. But look at this. What if I double click on this number? This is called the drill down feature or show details in a pivot table. If I double click on this number, another sheet is created and I would have unpivoted my data. I can go now and change the label. I'm going to change this to car, change the second column header to month, and if I want, I can change the third one as well. And I was able to unpivot a cross-tabulated list. Here is a very valuable bonus tip for you. You can unpivot a list either by using Power Query or dynamic array functions. And I encourage you to watch this tutorial in which I compare the two methods, unpivoting by using Power Query or unpivoting by using dynamic array functions. You will find the link in the description below the video. Tip number 8, stop the drill down feature. I just talked about the drill down feature in a pivot table. You can either right click and select show details from the right click menu, or you can double click on this number, which is Daniel in the South region, and you will get all the records for Daniel in the South region that contributed to this amount. I double click, and here is the drill down feature, and the report is created. That's wonderful. What if you want to stop this functionality? It's possible that you don't want anyone to use the drill down feature or the show details. So you can stop it by right clicking and then select pivot table options, and then you go to the data tab. And here is the option. Take the check away from enable show details, and no one will be able to drill down anymore. If I double click, you get this message box. We can change part of this pivot table. You hit OK, and the drill down feature is deactivated. Tip number 9, changing the default pivot table layout. Every time I create a pivot table with multiple fields in the rows area, I like to switch to the tabular layout. And in the tabular layout, it automatically populates the column header. It separates the different fields into multiple columns. I also remove the grand total for the rows, leaving only the grand total for the columns. If this is your preferred layout, then you can save it, and every time you create a pivot table, it will have the same structure and the same layout. To do that, I open the Excel options dialog box. The shortcut is Alt-FT, and then I hit D for data, and here is how I change the default layout. I click on Edit Default Layout, and I can do one of two things. I can either change the options for subtotal, grand total, report layout, or I can simply select a cell in the pivot table and I click import. It adjusts all the options automatically. All what you need to do is to hit OK, and you would have saved this layout as a default. A bonus tip for you. What about the layout of the pivot table field list? I'm going to open the pivot table field list with the shortcut Alt-JTL, and the default layout for the pivot table field list is totally different. It's a compact layout. So if I click on Tools, the gear icon, and then I select the first option, I have the field list at the top and 4 drop areas. I don't have a preference to this layout, especially if we are creating a pivot table out of multiple tables available in the data model. Then changing the layout from here, I select the second option. It allows me to see all the fields on one side and 4 drop areas. You have some other self-explanatory options as well. Tip number 10, different fiscal year. From this list, I want to create a pivot table that shows the sum of sales for each month in each quarter. I select any single cell, and then I go to the Insert tab of the ribbon. I click on Pivot Table, and I want to create my pivot table in the existing worksheet. Then I select a destination. I hit OK. I drag the date to the rows. Automatically, Excel will split the date into its components. I don't want the year, then I take it out. And I don't want date, and I take it out. I end up by having the quarter and month. I drag the sales to the values area, and I would have created my pivot table. I start by expanding this field. I right-click, and I select Expand Collapse, Expand Entire Field. And then I go to the Design tab of the ribbon. I change the layout to a tabular form. I can also format the numbers, right-click, Number Format, and I want an accounting number format, and I hit OK. I also don't want the subtotal, then I hide the subtotal. On the left side of the Design tab, do not show subtotals, and I would have created my pivot table. Quarter 1, January, February, and March, Quarter 2, April, May, June, and so on. In some companies, the fiscal quarter doesn't match the calendar quarter. So let's assume that the fiscal year starts on the 1st of July. Then how can I fix this issue? If July, August, September is quarter 1, I select quarter 3 and I type quarter 1. Accordingly, October, November, December will be quarter 2, January, February, March will be 3, and April, May, June will be 4. After editing the quarter, I want quarter 1 to be at the beginning. Here is the trick. I select quarter 2, right-click, move to beginning. And then I select quarter 1, right-click, move to beginning. And now we have the proper order corresponding to the fiscal year starting in July. Quarter 1, July, August, September, 2, 3, 4, everything looks great. A bonus tip for you, if your source data changes, you can refresh the pivot table with the shortcut Alt F5. We have a better shortcut that can take care of refreshing Power Query and pivot table, that is Control Alt F5. Tip number 11. It's also about the fiscal year. For some companies, the fiscal year starts on the 1st of November, or it may start on any month. The problem is, the fiscal quarter doesn't include the same combination of months like any calendar quarter. Then moving up and down won't help in this situation. If this is the case, then I need to create 2 helper columns in the source data. Let's create the 2 helper columns and explain them. I want to create a column that returns the fiscal year. And here is the function I'll be creating. I look at the month for the transactional date and I say, if it's less or equal 10, then it is less than November, then the fiscal year will be the same year at the transactional date. Otherwise, add 1. And I hit enter. I also want to calculate the fiscal quarter. Look at this picture, because the fiscal year starts on the 1st of November, then quarter 1 will be November, December, and January. Quarter 2 will be February, March, and April, and so on. So I want to look at the date and accordingly extract the fiscal quarter. And I'll be using a choose function to do that. Here is my function. The choose function extracts the month from the transactional date, and accordingly, it will return one of these values in the same exact order. I hit enter, and this is quarter 3. I can copy the two functions down. Now I want to create my pivot table. I go to the Insert tab of the ribbon. I click on Pivot Table. I want to create it in the existing worksheet. I select the destination. I hit OK. I drag the fiscal year to the rows. I drag the fiscal quarter to the rows. And I drag the date as well to the rows. When I drag the date, I'm splitting it into its components. I just want to keep the month, then I take the years out, and I take the quarters out, and I keep the month, and I take the date out. Now I drag the sales to the values area, and I close the pivot table field list. I want to improve the appearance, then I change the layout on the Design tab. I click on the down arrow for Report Layout, and I select Show in Tabular Form. And I don't want any subtotal, then I select Do Not Show Subtotal to clean the pivot table a little bit. On the Pivot Table Analyze tab, I hide the plus and minus buttons, and now I would have created my pivot table. The only thing remaining is that I don't read quarter here in this case, and this can be fixed by using formatting. Then I select this column, I right-click, and I select Format Cell. I go to Custom, and instead of General, I'll be typing in double quotation QTR, and then a space, and then double quote, and then 0. I hit OK, and I have the quarters. If you want within each quarter to sort the month, then create a custom list and sort this column by following the pattern of the custom list you create. I explained that in tip number 4. Tip number 12. Create relationships. You can create a pivot table out of multiple tables available in Excel. I have in this worksheet a table that I named Product Table, and I have another table that I named Province Table. In the Province table, I have a region column, while in the Product table, I have units and retail. If you multiply the units by the retail, you get the revenue, and I would like to calculate the revenue for each one of the regions. So I start by clicking on the Data tab of the ribbon, and I click on the right side on Relationships. I want to create a new relationship between these two sources, so I click on New, I click on the down arrow for Table, I select the Product T, and from the lower drop list I select the Province T. I select the matching field. The matching field is the code and code, and I select code, and I select from the second one the code, and I hit OK to create the relationship. The relationship is created, then I close, and now I can create my pivot table. I want to create a pivot table out of the data model. I select any cell, and I can go to the Insert tab of the ribbon, and I click on the down arrow for pivot table, and I select from data model. I hit OK, and now I can start creating my pivot table from the provinces T. I select the region, and I drag it to the rows. But how in the world can I get the revenue? I need to create a measure. So I right-click on the product table, and I say Add Measure. I want to give a name to the measure. I will name it Revenue, and this measure simply will multiply for each row the units by the retail and will sum the result. So I'll be using a DAX function to do that, and the DAX function is called SumX. So I type equal SumX, and then I hit Tab. The SumX function requires the name of the table, and the name of the table is the product table. This is where it lives. So I select product T, I type a comma, and the script tip says, what's your expression? My expression is to multiply two fields, units and retail. A field is typed in square brackets, so I type an opening square bracket and I select the units. I multiply and another opening square bracket and I select the retail, and I close the bracket for the SumX function. This is the monetary value. I want to format it as currency, and then I hit OK, and I would have created this field in the product table. Let's check. I expand product and I drag the revenue. Voila, I calculated the sum of revenue for each one of the regions, and we created a measure along the way. Those were my tips for mastering pivot tables. Let me know in a comment which ones you like most. And if you found value in this tutorial, give it a thumbs up and make sure you subscribe to my channel to be notified when new tutorials are released. The best is yet to come. Thanks for watching and see you next time.